At first, no one thought it was the answer. The P-51 Mustang arrived in Europe during 1943, and pilots looked at it with measured skepticism. It was not that the aircraft lacked capability. On paper, it performed well. It was fast, maneuverable, and built with clean lines that suggested efficiency. But paper specifications did not translate directly into trust. The men who would fly these machines into hostile airspace had seen promises before. They had flown aircraft that looked adequate in documentation, but faltered under the pressures of actual combat. So when the P-51 began arriving at airfields across England, the reception was neither enthusiastic nor dismissive. It was cautious. Pilots reserved judgment. They waited to see what the aircraft could actually do when it mattered. The skepticism was not rooted in hostility. It came from experience. Fighter pilots in the European theater had been flying missions for months, some for years. They understood the demands of high-altitude combat over Germany. They knew what it felt like when fuel gauges dropped toward empty while still hundreds of miles from home. They had seen friends turn back because their aircraft could not sustain the range required for deep penetration missions. The existing fighters in service, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, were formidable machines in their own right. The P-47 was rugged and could absorb punishment. The P-38 had range and firepower. But neither could stay with the bombers all the way to targets deep inside the Reich and back again. That limitation shaped every mission. Bomber crews flew into the heart of German defenses, knowing that at some point, their fighter escort would have to turn back. Beyond that point, they were alone. The P-51 was introduced into this environment without fanfare. It did not arrive with bold claims or promises of superiority. It simply began appearing on flight lines, and squadrons began transitioning to it. The initial reaction among pilots was measured. Some appreciated its speed. Others noted its handling characteristics. But there was hesitation. The aircraft was lighter than the P-47, and that raised questions about durability. It carried less ammunition than some pilots preferred. Its range was discussed, but range alone did not determine success in combat. What mattered was whether the aircraft could fulfill the mission while keeping its pilot alive. That question remained unanswered in those early weeks. Pilots flew training sorties. They tested the aircraft in various configurations. They discussed its strengths and weaknesses in ready rooms and over meals. But consensus did not form quickly. The P-51 was present, but it had not yet proven itself indispensable. Part of the dismissal stemmed from doctrine. Fighter tactics in the European theater had evolved around specific principles. Fighters were expected to engage enemy aircraft aggressively. They were meant to clear the sky, to seek out Luftwaffe fighters and destroy them before they could reach the bombers. This approach demanded speed, climb rate, and firepower. It emphasized offensive action. The P-47 excelled in this role. It could dive rapidly, absorb damage, and press attacks with confidence. Pilots who had flown the P-47 extensively understood its strengths and had developed tactics that maximized those strengths. When the P-51 arrived, it was evaluated against this established framework. It was faster at altitude, it turned tighter, but it did not fit neatly into the aggressive, seek-and-destroy model that had been refined over countless missions. Some pilots wondered if the P-51 was simply a different tool for the same job. Others questioned whether it was the right tool at all. The aircraft's origin story did not help its case. The P-51 had been designed initially for the British Royal Air Force, not the United States Army Air Forces. It had been developed rapidly by North American Aviation, a company without prior fighter experience. Early versions of the aircraft, powered by Allison engines, performed adequately at low altitudes but struggled at the heights where combat over Europe occurred. Those early models served in tactical roles, ground attack and reconnaissance, but they did not challenge the dominance of established fighters in air-to-air combat. When the P-51B variant appeared, equipped with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built under license by Packard, performance improved dramatically. The aircraft could now operate effectively at 25,000 feet and above. But the reputational shadow of those early versions lingered. Pilots remembered the limitations. They remembered that the Mustang had been considered secondary to other types. Changing that perception required more than technical improvements. It required proof. The strategic bombing campaign over Germany faced a fundamental problem that no amount of firepower could solve. Heavy bombers, primarily B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, carried the war deep into German industrial centers. They struck factories, refineries, rail yards, and other targets critical to the Nazi war machine. These missions were essential to the Allied strategy. But they came at a terrible cost. German defenses were formidable. Flak batteries surrounded high-value targets, filling the sky with exploding shells. Luftwaffe fighter units, though increasingly stretched, still possessed skilled pilots and capable aircraft. They attacked bomber formations with tactics refined through hard experience. They knew where bombers were vulnerable. They knew how to press attacks despite defensive fire. And they knew that once fighter escort turned back, the bombers became easier prey. The losses were unsustainable. On certain missions, attrition rates climbed above acceptable thresholds. Entire squadrons were decimated. Crews who survived one mission faced the prospect of flying into the same deadly environment again and again. Morale suffered. The question was not whether the bombing campaign should continue. Strategic necessity demanded it. The question was how to reduce losses to a level that allowed sustained operations. The answer in principle was clear. Bombers needed continuous fighter escort from takeoff to landing. If fighters could remain with the formations throughout the mission, attacking German fighters could be intercepted before they reached the bombers. Losses would decline. Mission effectiveness would increase. But achieving continuous escort required fighters with sufficient range to accompany bombers to distant targets and return safely. For most of 1943, that capability did not exist. Fighter range was determined by fuel capacity and efficiency. The P-47 Thunderbolt, despite its strengths, consumed fuel rapidly. With internal tanks alone, it could escort bombers partway into Germany but not to Berlin or beyond. External drop tanks extended range, but even with these additions there remained a gap. Missions to the deepest targets still included a portion where bombers flew unescorted. The P-38 Lightning had better range, but it was less effective at high altitude where engine performance issues emerged. Production could not meet demand. Squadrons were often under strength. The 8th Air Force, responsible for daylight bombing over Europe, faced a dilemma. Missions had to continue. Targets had to be struck. But the losses incurred without adequate escort threatened the viability of the entire campaign. Something had to change. When the P-51B entered service in significant numbers during late 1943, its range became the subject of careful analysis. Initial assessments indicated that with internal fuel and standard drop tanks, it could reach targets the P-47 could not. But range figures on paper did not account for combat conditions. Fighters did not fly in straight lines at optimal cruise speeds. They maneuvered. They climbed and dove. They engaged in combat that burned fuel at higher rates. Pilots needed reserves for emergencies and for the return leg of the mission. So while the P-51 possessed greater range than its predecessors, questions remained about whether that range was sufficient under actual operational conditions. Planners studied fuel consumption data. They calculated distances and flight times. They consulted with experienced pilots about realistic fuel management. Slowly, a picture emerged. The P-51 could, in theory, escort bombers to Berlin and back. But making that theory operational required more than just aircraft. It required a shift in how those aircraft were employed. The escort problem was not merely technical, it was tactical and doctrinal. Existing fighter tactics emphasized aggressive patrolling. Fighters would sweep ahead of bomber formations, seeking enemy fighters. They would engage threats wherever they appeared, sometimes pursuing German aircraft away from the bombers in extended dogfights. This approach had merit. It kept German fighters occupied. It disrupted their attack formations. But it also dispersed the escort. Fighters chasing individual targets lost sight of the bombers they were supposed to protect. Gaps opened. German fighters exploited those gaps. Some bomber groups received concentrated protection while others found themselves exposed. The system worked inconsistently. On some missions, losses remained low. On others, they spiked. The variability was dangerous. It meant that bomber crews could not rely on protection. It meant that even with fighters present, safety was not guaranteed. Commanders recognized this inconsistency. They discussed it in planning sessions. They reviewed mission reports. They listened to debriefings from pilots and bomber crews. The feedback was clear. Bomber crews felt most secure when fighters remained visible, when they could see escorts above and around them throughout the mission. Pilots reported that staying close to the bombers often meant passing up opportunities to engage distant targets. There was tension between these two approaches. One prioritized aggressive offense, the other prioritized defensive presence. Both had advocates, both seemed reasonable, but resources were finite. Fighter groups could not do everything simultaneously. Choices had to be made, and those choices would determine whether the bombing campaign could continue at the intensity required to achieve strategic objectives. The decision did not come from a single directive. It emerged gradually through a series of adjustments, consultations, and recalibrations. Commanders at various levels within the 8th Air Force began questioning the effectiveness of existing escort tactics. They reviewed loss statistics. They mapped where bomber formations were most vulnerable. They correlated German fighter activity with the positioning of American escorts. Patterns became visible. Bomber losses spiked during periods when escorts were drawn away from the formations. Conversely, when escorts remained close, even if they engaged fewer enemy fighters overall, bomber losses decreased. The data suggested that presence mattered as much as kills. Protection was not solely about destroying threats. It was about deterring them, disrupting their attacks, and maintaining a defensive envelope around the bombers. This realization prompted discussions about how to employ the P-51. If the aircraft's primary value was range, then that range should be used to maintain continuous presence rather than to chase distant targets. Fighters should stay with the bombers. They should position themselves where they could intercept threats before those threats reached attack positions. They should prioritize proximity over pursuit. This represented a shift in emphasis. It did not mean fighters would refuse combat. It meant they would choose their engagements more carefully. A German fighter approaching a bomber formation would be intercepted, but a German fighter fleeing away from the bombers might be allowed to escape if pursuing it meant leaving the formation exposed. The distinction was subtle but significant. It required discipline. It required pilots to resist the instinct to chase. Implementing this approach required clear communication. Squadron commanders briefed their pilots on the new priorities. They emphasized that mission success was defined by bomber survival, not by individual kill counts. They explained that staying with the bombers, even when it meant passing up apparent opportunities, was the correct tactical choice. Some pilots accepted this readily. They understood the strategic picture. They recognized that every bomber that completed its mission contributed to weakening Germany's capacity to wage war. Other pilots were less certain. Fighter pilots were trained to be aggressive. They were selected for qualities that included initiative and offensive spirit. Asking them to exercise restraint, to prioritize position over action, ran counter to some of their instincts. But orders were clear. The mission was escort. Everything else was secondary. The first missions flown under this revised doctrine were watched closely. Planners monitored results. They tracked bomber losses. They reviewed reports from both fighter pilots and bomber crews. The outcomes were instructive. Bomber losses on missions with close P-51 escort decreased noticeably. German fighters still attacked, but their effectiveness diminished. The constant presence of American fighters forced German pilots to approach more cautiously. It disrupted their coordination. It gave them less time to set up attacks. Even when German fighters managed to engage bombers, the proximity of American escorts meant they had less time to press their attacks before being intercepted. The defensive envelope held. Bombers reached their targets and returned in greater numbers. The statistics validated the approach, but the decision was not without cost. Fighter pilots flying close escort engaged fewer targets than they had under previous tactics. Individual kill tallies declined. For pilots who measured success by victories, this was frustrating. They saw enemy aircraft that they might have pursued and destroyed. They held their positions instead. Some questioned whether they were being used effectively, but experienced pilots recognized the difference. They saw that bomber crews returned more consistently. They heard fewer reports of formations being decimated. They understood that the mission was larger than individual achievements. Gradually, acceptance spread. The P-51 was being employed according to its strengths. It was staying with the bombers. And staying was proving more valuable than anyone had initially anticipated. The realization did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated through experience. Pilots who flew repeated escort missions in the P-51 began to notice patterns. They observed how German fighters reacted to their presence. They saw that even when they did not fire a shot, their proximity altered enemy behavior. German pilots who spotted American escorts nearby often broke off attacks prematurely or declined to press home their runs. The mere presence of fighters positioned to intercept created hesitation. That hesitation bought bombers time. It reduced the accuracy of German attacks. It saved lives. Pilots began to understand that their role was not simply to destroy enemy aircraft. It was to control the space around the bombers, to dominate the environment, and to impose costs on any German pilot who attempted to attack. This understanding shifted how pilots thought about their aircraft. The P-51 was not merely a high-performance fighter. It was a platform for sustained presence. Its range allowed it to remain with the bombers for the entire mission. Its speed and maneuverability allowed it to respond quickly to threats. Its efficiency allowed it to patrol without constantly worrying about fuel. These characteristics combined to create a capability that previous fighters lacked. The P-47 was more rugged, but it could not stay. The P-38 had range, but it struggled at high altitude. The P-51 balanced the requirements. It could fly high, fast, far, and long. That balance made it uniquely suited to the escort mission. Pilots who had initially dismissed it as just another fighter began to appreciate its specific strengths. Bomber crews noticed the difference immediately. They could see P-51s above and around them throughout missions. They watched as escorts intercepted German fighters before they reached attack positions. They felt more secure knowing that protection was continuous rather than intermittent. The psychological impact was significant. Crews who had previously felt abandoned once escorts turned back now flew entire missions with fighters visible. That visibility reduced stress. It improved focus. Crews could concentrate on navigation, bombing accuracy, and formation discipline without constantly scanning for unescorted threats. The improvement in morale was measurable. Crews volunteered for missions with more confidence. Completion rates improved. The effectiveness of the strategic bombing campaign increased not just because losses declined, but because the bombers themselves performed better under the protection continuous escort provided. German pilots faced a changed environment. Previously, they had known that at a certain point during bomber missions, American fighters would turn back. Beyond that point, attacks could be pressed with less risk. German tactics had evolved around this understanding. Units would shadow bomber formations, waiting for the escorts to depart before attacking in force. But with P-51s providing continuous escort, that opportunity disappeared. German fighters now faced opposition throughout the mission. They could not wait for a safe moment. If they attacked, they did so knowing American fighters were present to intercept. This forced German units to commit more resources to each interception. It increased their losses. It reduced their effectiveness. Over time, German fighter units became more cautious. They chose their attacks more carefully. They avoided situations where American fighters had positional advantage. The initiative shifted. The realization extended to strategic planning. Commanders recognized that the P-51's value lay not in its performance in individual dogfights, but in its ability to sustain a defensive posture over long distances. This insight informed decisions about production priorities, training programs, and operational planning. More P-51s were ordered. Pilot training emphasized escort discipline and fuel management. Mission planning incorporated the assumption of continuous fighter presence. The aircraft became integral to the bombing campaign's success. What had been dismissed months earlier as just another fighter was now understood to be the solution to a problem that had threatened the entire strategic bombing effort. The shift in perception was complete. The P-51 was no longer questioned. It was essential. The shift in operational approach became doctrine. By early 1944, the 8th Air Force had fully integrated the P-51 into its escort strategy. Fighter groups transitioned from P-47s and P-38s to Mustangs. Training programs standardized escort procedures. Pilots learned to fly formations designed to maximize coverage of bomber groups. They practiced intercept patterns that prioritized rapid response over extended pursuit. They rehearsed fuel management techniques that ensured sufficient reserves for the return leg of missions. The emphasis on discipline and restraint became embedded in training. New pilots arrived at operational squadrons with a clear understanding of their mission. They were not there to hunt. They were there to protect. That clarity of purpose shaped how they flew. The impact on bomber operations was profound. With continuous escort available, mission planners could target locations previously considered too distant or too heavily defended. Berlin, which had been beyond reliable escort range, became a regular target. Industrial centers deep in southern Germany, areas that had received limited attention due to escort limitations, now faced sustained bombing. The strategic bombing campaign expanded both in scope and intensity. Targets that German defenses had shielded through distance were no longer safe. The Luftwaffe could not concentrate its defenses because American bombers could strike anywhere. This dispersal weakened German air defenses overall. Resources had to be spread across more territory. Fighter units were stretched thinner. The cumulative effect was a steady erosion of German defensive capability. Luftwaffe commanders recognized the problem. They understood that the arrival of long-range American escorts had changed the strategic calculus. They attempted to adapt. German fighter units experimented with new tactics. They tried massed formations designed to overwhelm escorts. They developed rocket-armed fighters to attack bombers from outside the range of defensive fire. They stationed fighters at fields positioned to intercept bombers after they left their targets, hoping to catch them when fuel and ammunition were low. Some of these tactics achieved limited success, but none reversed the fundamental shift. American fighters could stay with the bombers. As long as that remained true, German attacks carried higher risk and achieved lower success rates. The Luftwaffe's ability to impose unacceptable losses on American bomber formations steadily diminished. The shift was not without challenges. Maintaining aircraft over such long distances required excellent maintenance and logistics. Engine reliability became critical. A mechanical failure deep over Germany could leave a pilot stranded in hostile territory with no prospect of rescue. Ground crews worked intensively to ensure aircraft were mission-ready. They checked every system. They addressed minor issues before they became major failures. The supply chain stretched to provide parts, fuel, and ammunition in sufficient quantities. Air bases in England became hubs of continuous activity. Aircraft returned from missions, were serviced, refueled, rearmed, and prepared for the next sortie. The operational tempo was relentless, but it was sustainable because the P-51's design made it maintainable. Parts were accessible. Systems were relatively simple. Crews could turn aircraft around quickly. That reliability enabled the sustained operations that continuous escort required. Pilots adapted to the demands of long-duration missions. Flights lasting 4 to 5 hours were common. Sitting in a cramped cockpit at high altitude, breathing oxygen through a mask, monitoring instruments, and maintaining formation discipline for that length of time was physically and mentally exhausting. Pilots developed techniques to manage fatigue. They learned to pace themselves, to stay alert without becoming overstimulated. They learned to trust their instruments and their training when fatigue made concentration difficult. They learned to support each other, to watch for signs that a wingman was struggling. The mutual reliance that developed within squadrons was essential. No pilot flew alone. Every pilot depended on others. That interdependence created cohesion. Squadrons became tightly knit units where trust was absolute. That trust translated into effectiveness in combat. The impact of the Escort decision extended beyond immediate tactical outcomes. It reshaped the air war over Europe. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was operating under conditions it could not sustain. Fighter units faced American escorts on nearly every mission. Losses mounted. Experienced pilots were killed or captured. Replacements lacked adequate training. Fuel shortages limited training hours, so new pilots arrived at operational units unprepared for the intensity of combat. The quality of German fighter forces declined. Meanwhile, American fighter units grew more experienced. Pilots learned from each mission. Tactics were refined. Coordination improved. The disparity widened. German fighters still fought, and they still achieved occasional successes. But they could no longer contest American air superiority consistently. The sky over Germany belonged to the Allies. This air superiority had cascading effects. Bombers struck targets with increasing accuracy. Factories were destroyed or damaged. Oil production declined. Rail networks were disrupted. The German war economy, already strained by years of conflict, began to crumble. The strategic bombing campaign achieved its objectives not merely through tonnage of bombs dropped, but through sustained pressure applied consistently over time. That consistency was possible because bombers could reach their targets and return. And they returned because fighters stayed with them. The P-51's contribution to this outcome was direct and measurable. Without the capability it provided, the bombing campaign would have faced continued unsustainable losses. With it, the campaign succeeded. The impact was also felt on the ground. Allied forces preparing for the invasion of Normandy benefited from the degradation of German air power. The Luftwaffe's inability to challenge Allied air superiority meant that ground forces would operate with minimal interference from enemy aircraft. This advantage proved critical during the invasion and subsequent operations. Close air support, interdiction missions, and air superiority missions proceeded with effectiveness that would have been impossible if German air defenses had remained intact. The P-51's role in achieving this air superiority was indirect but significant. By enabling the strategic bombing campaign to proceed, it contributed to the broader weakening of German military capability. The aircraft designed to escort bombers helped create conditions for victory on multiple fronts. Individual pilots and crews experienced the impact personally. Bomber crews completed tours of duty with survival rates that improved dramatically compared to earlier periods. Pilots who flew escort missions took pride in the bombers they protected. They heard stories from crews who had returned safely because fighters had intercepted threats. They received thanks from men who might not have survived without their presence. This feedback reinforced the mission's purpose. It validated the doctrine of close escort. It confirmed that restraint and discipline achieved more than aggressive pursuit. Pilots who had questioned the approach in its early implementation became its strongest advocates. They had seen the results. They knew it worked. Historians would later analyze the Escort decision as a turning point. It represented a moment when doctrine adapted to capability. The P-51 provided a tool. The decision to employ that tool according to its strengths, rather than forcing it into existing frameworks, unlocked its potential. This alignment of technology and tactics produced results that neither could have achieved alone. The lesson extended beyond the specific circumstances of the air war over Europe. It illustrated the importance of understanding what a capability was designed to do, rather than what one wished it could do. The P-51 was not dismissed because it was inadequate. It was dismissed because its purpose was not immediately understood. Once that purpose became clear, once commanders recognized that staying mattered more than chasing, the aircraft transformed the campaign. The impact was decisive. The story of the P-51 Mustang is not a story of technological supremacy. It is a story of realization. The aircraft arrived in a theater where expectations had been shaped by different machines and different doctrines. It did not fit neatly into established patterns. Pilots were uncertain. Commanders were cautious. The aircraft possessed capabilities, but those capabilities were not immediately leveraged effectively. What changed was not the aircraft itself, but the understanding of how to use it. That understanding came through experience, analysis, and the willingness to question assumptions. It came from recognizing that the escort problem required sustained presence more than aggressive pursuit. It came from accepting that restraint could be more valuable than action. The escort decision exemplified this realization. By choosing to keep P-51s close to bomber formations, by prioritizing position over kills, by valuing discipline over initiative in certain contexts, commanders unlocked the aircraft's true potential. The decision was not dramatic. It did not involve revolutionary technology or unprecedented tactics. It involved applying existing capability in a way that aligned with strategic needs. The result was a transformation in the effectiveness of the strategic bombing campaign. Losses declined. Missions succeeded. The air war shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. The P-51 played a central role in that shift, not because it was the fastest or the most heavily armed fighter, but because it could stay. And staying was what mattered. The lesson resonates beyond the specific context of World War II. Capability without understanding remains potential unfulfilled. Technology provides tools, but tools must be employed according to their nature. The P-51 was designed for range and efficiency. Once those characteristics were understood and prioritized, the aircraft became indispensable. Before that understanding developed, it was just another fighter among many. The difference was not in the machine. It was in the comprehension of what the machine could do and what the mission required. Bridging that gap required observation, reflection, and adaptation. It required leaders willing to revise doctrine when evidence suggested change was necessary. Fighter pilots who flew the P-51 developed a deep respect for the aircraft. They trusted it to bring them home from distant targets. They relied on its performance at high altitude. They appreciated its handling characteristics in combat. But more than any specific attribute, they valued what the aircraft allowed them to do. It allowed them to fulfill the mission. It allowed them to stay with the bombers they were assigned to protect. It allowed them to provide the continuous presence that made the escort effective. In that sense, the P-51 was not about individual capability. It was about enabling a collective effort. It was about making sure bombers reached their targets and crews returned. That purpose defined the aircraft's legacy. Bomber crews remembered the P-51 with gratitude. They remembered seeing escorts above them throughout missions. They remembered the reassurance that came from knowing protection was continuous. They remembered missions where German fighters were intercepted before reaching attack positions. They remembered landing safely, again and again, because someone had stayed. The aircraft became a symbol of reliability. It represented the commitment of fighter pilots to the mission of escort. It demonstrated that even in the chaos of combat, discipline and presence could impose order. For those who flew in the bombers, the P-51 was more than a machine. It was a promise kept. The dismissal of the P-51 was never absolute. It was provisional. It was the natural caution of people who had learned not to trust promises without proof. The aircraft provided that proof through performance. But performance alone was insufficient. What mattered was the decision to employ that performance correctly. The escort decision was not about choosing one tactic over another. It was about recognizing what the mission actually required and aligning resources to meet that requirement. Once that alignment occurred, the potential of the P-51 was realized. The aircraft did what it was designed to do. It stayed. And in staying, it changed everything. The P-51 was never meant to win every fight. It was built to stay. And staying changed everything.